Hello there, it's June the 6th today, it's the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and there'll be a lot of major commemorations going on in Britain and in France and indeed elsewhere during the course of the day. And it seemed that I really had to post a video in this playlist about my novel Hill 112 today. Now, I'm not actually going to talk about the novel itself, or because that's something I've covered in some of the other videos, and there'll be more to come. The novel's been released, it's been out for just over a week and a half now, 2 weeks actually, sorry, and there's been some nice reviews. Hopefully, I think it's one of those things where so far not many people are aware it exists, so that's partly the point of doing videos like this. So ultimately, yes, I hope that doing this will sell me a few more books, because I'm obviously a biased audience, but I'm proud of the novel. I think it gives a flavour for what went on, for the experience of the young British soldiers who were there, that people will find interesting. And mostly, most of the reviews, even on the sort of the various sites where anybody can do it, the vast majority really like it. There's a few people clearly it doesn't click with, but that's always going to be the way. That's the nature of anything. You can't please everybody, but it's nice that some have got what I was trying to do. And there was a nice review in the Times online that where again I think there was a sense, yeah, this is I see what I'm doing and it works. So that was very kind of them. But today I'm not going to talk about the novel, though, as I say, I've done my little bit of a reminder that hopefully, yes, please buy the book, and I hope you like it. I thought I'd talk today about some other reading around D-Day and the Battle for Normandy. This is partly drawn from the historical note at the end of the book, but also more generally, just recommendations. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there, particularly people inclined to look at a YouTube channel like this, who have an interest in history and have a fair knowledge already. But I thought I'd just mention some of the books that I think are good starting places for an overview of the campaign and for aspects of detail. Now, in the broader context of not just D-Day and Normandy itself, but the campaign in Northwest Europe from D-Day onwards, I would say one of the best starting places from recent books would be Rick Atkinson's, now which one's it's called? The Guns at Last Light. It's the conclusion of his trilogy that began with the Tunisian campaign, then Sicily and Italy. And while it's primarily focused on the US Army and its development during this period, he covers the wider context extremely well. To me, he's very, very fair to allies like the British and Canadians and later French and others. He's probably a lot kinder to Montgomery than many authors, including most British authors, are these days. So it's a very good balanced account. It's also eminently readable. The man writes with great style. He produces these little nuggets of information he's dug out of archives that are new even to folk like myself who've been fascinated by this era for a long, long time. So I've read a lot, but I still found there were things thinking, oh, I'd never thought of it that way, or I didn't know that particular detail. So overview of not just Normandy, but Northwest Europe up until the end, I think that's a very good starting place. For D-Day itself, obviously it's still worth getting out Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day. It's a very good account. He talked to a lot of people and I think he was backed by Reader's Digest and had extensive interviews going out and doing things. Plenty of people were still alive then who'd been in comparatively senior positions. So you get one of those patterns. Obviously it's a theme that by today's commemorations there are very, very few veterans left still with us. All of the ones that are there were people of pretty junior rank in 1944, because that's 80 years ago. So, at the very least, you're in your high 90s, and many are older. So we don't get the battalion commanders, we don't get the, let alone the brigade, divisional, corps commanders and above. It's a long time since you could interview the people making some of the key decisions. So Ryan was writing at a time when all this was much fresher and plenty of these people were still alive. Now, obviously, while they were alive, they also had agendas of their own, and people, particularly the higher command, were trying to justify, well, I did the right thing because, or maybe this didn't work out, but I had good intentions. Nowadays, we'll still get that, but we'll get there in the accounts they wrote, the interviews they gave, this sort of thing. So Cornelius Ryan book is very good, and apparently, there's far more material that he didn't actually get to use in the book that is there in archives and can be consulted by researchers. Stephen Ambrose's book D-Day is decent as well. It very much concentrates on the two American beaches, and particularly Omaha. But it's well worth a look. There's a lot there that's interesting. However, I would say for D-Day itself and for the build-up to it, then by far the best is the fairly recent Peter Adams book, Sand and Steel, A New History of D-Day. And this is genuinely new because he covers in great depth all the preparations, which is something that people tend to forget. We skate over the months and months of training, all the different exercises. You hear about the one that went disastrously wrong in the build-up to D-Day in Devon, but we don't hear about plenty of the others. And the other exercises where groups would march or drive, embark on landing craft, landing ships, then disembark and march so far inland and all this sort of thing. He covers all of that in immense detail. He covers the impact on Britain of having all these troops, of having these millions of soldiers, many of them Americans, but Canadians, British as well, bivouacking in the English countryside, and what that meant. I mean, I live in South Wales, and I was looking at a local museum recently, and it had maps of all the major American camps that were in this area. South Wales is in the west, and it meant that because the American beaches were in the west, most of the American troops embarked in ports in Western England and South Wales because that was the more direct route, whereas the British and Canadians went from ones to the east. My own mother, who was a schoolgirl at the time, can remember being in Cardiff on D-Day and the constant stream of trucks queuing along the road which was heading towards Cardiff docks of Americans going to I think most of them were going to Omaha. There was certainly one chap who was a mortar man that had visited the family because, living opposite a chapel, they kept open house for servicemen on, when they were on a pass out, that sort of thing, as did so many at the time. And an American kept in touch with my grandmother, apparently. They were writing back and forth in letters because he was missing. He had a wife and child back in the States and was missing his family, so liked being around a family and children, and they sort of correspond. I think my grandmother may have become a sort of mother figure to him a little bit, but he certainly landed on Omaha. I'm not sure on which day, and I think some of the troops from Cardiff probably was support waves and follow-up rather than the initial landing, of course, but I haven't gone into it in that detail. But Adams covers all of that and makes it very interesting as well. He then covers in greater detail than I've seen anywhere else all 5 of the invasion beaches, as well as the airborne landings as well. And that's particularly interesting because you sometimes forget, yes, in the simplest form, Utah is the easiest, Omaha the hardest, but there are bits on even those beaches that are different. There are a few sections of Omaha where it was relatively quiet and easy, though obviously that was not the story on the bulk of the beach, and there were parts of Juno, Gold and Sword where things were particularly tough, not on quite the same scale, but nevertheless pretty bad if you happened to be there, and places where the casualty rate was very high, and of course looks at the move inland afterwards. So to me, that's the really is the authoritative account. If you want to know about D-Day and how it all worked and how it happened, go to Peter Adams' Sand and Steel, because it's there and it's a good read. And again, it is something that I would say, even if you've read a lot, you will find a lot that is fresh in this. More broadly about the battle for Normandy, there's quite a range of good, pretty recent books like Anthony Beevor's D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, James Holland, Normandy 44, a little bit older, Max Hastings' Overlord. They all have their virtues in different ways, and each of them has a different style, and if you know the authors, you'll be familiar with them, but they're all well worth reading. James Holland has been good at combining the sort of really big picture stuff of production, of looking at a weapon or a tank not simply as what it can do, but how easy it is to produce, maintain, transport, all this sort of thing. Combining that with the personal experiences of what it meant to be at the sharp end. And each of those authors does that sort of thing in a different way, and each has a different emphasis on the struggles between the high command, the friction between Montgomery and others, Eisenhower's role in it all. They each have their different take on this, and they are three very good books, but they're also three different books, even though the topic is the same, so it's well worth, you get the time, read them all. Max Hastings' one obviously is the oldest of those and has been around quite a while. I remember reading this as a student, and I would still hold it up as a model of how to write military history, in that it combines the personal experience, what it was like to be there, with the strategic background, the personalities, the ambitions, the clashes between the high command on both sides. And it covers both very thoroughly, and it's done with insight but with style. I would say the central thesis of the sort of all singing, all dancing Wehrmacht that is simply better than the Allied armies, that with the exception of paratroopers, commandos, rangers, that sort of thing, that Allied troops are just about always outclassed by their German equivalents, at the very least pushes too far. It was a big deal at the time. The book was written in the 80s, and it was still in the Cold War. You'd had that whole trend within the US Army in particular, but NATO more generally, of thinking, well, if we're going to have to fight the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets, let's go and look at the Germans. How did they fight the Soviet army? And you're allowing lots of former German officers to say, well, we would have won if Hitler hadn't made all these bad decisions. We were better, that quality can prevail over quantity, which, given that NATO never had the quantity compared to the Warsaw Pact, was a lesson we wanted to hear. So there's a background to it, and there was an element of exaggeration. And, it's no coincidence that when the US Army gradually developed the new style of helmet, you had one that was rather German looking compared to the rounder Second World War style helmet that I think had become associated with failure in Vietnam. It's a little bit like dressing your army as Frenchmen in the 19th century because you're trying to capture the spirit of Napoleon's army. Hence you have kepis and you zouaves and all this sort of thing in the... Armies do this. They go with fashion, and they go with an idea. If we can dress like that, then we might fight like that, and we might win like that. People would copy the Roman army in the past, and in the ancient world, it's the same idea. And the British army defeated cuirassiers and lancers as part of the French army at Waterloo, and in the years following immediately introduces cuirassiers for the lifeguards and others, and lances, things it hasn't done before, because the perception is, well, the French were so good, we've got to copy what they were doing, rightly or wrongly. So I think he pushes that argument a little too far, particularly as he never really faces up to one of the central truths of the Normandy campaign, is that while local German counterattacks could and did work, none of their major offensives came together at all and succeeded. And it may just be that in the conditions of Normandy, which is very densely crowded with troops, because the Germans don't withdraw, there's a lot of men and tanks per square mile of Normandy, so with a density you never have on the Eastern Front, or indeed anywhere else really in the Western Europe. It makes for a different type of attritional fighting, and I'm not sure that the Germans show any greater skill when it comes to attack. Now, there's various reasons for that. There are strategic ones. It's all to do with the deception plans about another invasion in the Pas-de-Calais. It's to do with the difficulty of getting German troops in Normandy when the rail infrastructure has been bombed to blazes by the Allied air forces. All sorts of things. It's more complicated. So, again, I can understand the viewpoint. I'm no longer convinced that it's anywhere near as simple as he maintains. And I think he's modified a little bit in books like, is it Nemesis, whichever is the one that does the rest of the Northwest Europe campaign. I can never remember which one is that one and which one's the one about the war in the Pacific. But anyway, it's a very, very well-written book. Whether or not you agree with aspects of its central thesis like that, it's still well worth a read. And, these are views that are definitely worth deep consideration. You have to have a good reason if you want to disagree with them. And I would say it's more one of degree to which he pushes. I think he pushes it too far rather than necessarily it's utterly wrong. It's just more complicated than that. So those are very good books on the wider battle for Normandy, which are a reminder that this goes on for several months. Now I'll just mention a few things. Oh, sorry. One more on that I'd like to talk about, because I think it's being reissued this year, and I bought a hardback of it in '84 when it came out for the 40th anniversaries. I'd already read the book from the local public library. This was one written much earlier. Again, it goes back to the sort of Longest Day era, when far more people were alive to interview. It's a book by a chap called Alexander McKee, and it's called Camp Anvil of Victory. It only really deals with the British and Canadian experience of Normandy. So the Americans get a mention, but it's not really about Omaha and Utah and the fighting inland to Corentin, Saint-Lô and all this sort of thing, and eventually Operation Cobra. But it is extremely good. Again, on this combination, it talks a bit about the wider strategy, about Montgomery, about friction between the high command, pressure from Churchill, Roosevelt and the like. But it is very much about the experience, what it was like to be a soldier in Normandy. He talked to veterans from both sides. You get lots of personal accounts interwoven in a way that is very interesting and gives a great flavour for the experience and just how dangerous and deadly it was. And it talks about British units that get pinned down, that break, that run away. It talks about shooting of prisoners on both sides, particularly obviously the cases of the Hitler-Jugend executing Canadian, mostly, and a few British prisoners in the early days of the campaign. Events that don't seem to be reproduced. The other SS Panzer divisions don't seem to quite behave in that way, and obviously, you know, there are elements of that. It's a complicated issue of quite what was going on, but there has been some very good research. There obviously was for the Nuremberg trials, but also more recently by Canadian scholars looking at aspects of this. But there's also the element, it's something that Rick Atkinson and others have picked up on, where you find cases where Allied troops have shot prisoners. Now, in the main, the commonest thing is rather different to that. This is when you storm a position and the Germans are manning their MG42 till the last minute, shooting down your mates, and then raise their hands when you arrive there with grenade, Sten gun or bayoneted rifle in hand, and their surrender isn't accepted, they're shot then. That's a rather different thing, when somebody's blood is up, when it's understandable that there are basically the perception, there are rules. You can't go on killing till the last minute and then expect to be spared. But there are other hints where somebody wanders off with a few prisoners, the witness hears a rattle of a Sten gun, and then the same man comes back smoking happily without any prisoners. Had they been shot? Had they not? There probably were cases of excesses, reprisals, even when you'd heard that the Germans had been shooting your men. He deals with these uncomfortable issues at an early stage and presents them very fairly. He looks at the conduct of how units were learning lessons, how a lot of the training and doctrine didn't really prepare them for the fighting as it developed in Normandy. And this is a theme that you'll find, elsewhere, and it was generally true of the Allied armies, and to some extent, the Max Hastings idea that the Germans were just better prepared for this than the Allies were, better motivated or more strongly motivated, partly because the German army shot so many of its own people in a way the Allies did not. There's some truth that many of the units, the majority of the people who went to Normandy, had not seen active service, not seen combat before. There were some veterans brought back from the Mediterranean, but not very many in proportion. And even some of the veteran units had been augmented by replacements. And you find, I remember a description, I think it's one of Stephen Ambrose's books, of Norman Coter, I always think of it was Robert Mitchum because that's who plays him in The Longest Day, finding a platoon of infantry and having to sort of instruct them in basic fire and movement tactics to clear some hedgerows in the days after D-Day, because they hadn't. Again, a lot of people, the big preparation for actually the landing, getting ashore, establishing themselves, meant that what was going to happen afterwards had rather been neglected. And many of these units had been training for so long they were stale. It was very hard to keep training to a fine edge over a long period when you don't know when you're actually going to do these things. And of course the conditions, what developed in Normandy wasn't really what everybody expected. They weren't prepared for the blockage terrain, but they were also not prepared for the Germans not to do a fighting retreat and to pull back to defensive line after defensive line as they'd done in Sicily and Italy, but instead to, largely on a Hitler order, stay in place and pound away. and stay and fight even within range of naval gunfire for such a long time, which meant that everything was very crowded, everything was very tightly focused. So it's an interesting book. There are lots of issues in it that are striking and challenging, even though there are some things that, for instance, you didn't know about the ultra secret, that hadn't been revealed at that point, and others that later research would suggest a different conclusion. It's well worth a read. It's a book that I very much enjoyed, and I think some of the roots of writing my novel come back to as a schoolboy, finding this in the Penarth Library here at home and just being drawn to it, because it dropped to, a lot of books were more about the strategy and the higher level, whereas I was a boy making model kits of Shermans and Panthers and Tigers and all this sort of thing, playing games with them. I wanted that level. I wanted to know about these things, and it's the sort of book that tells you about that sort of thing. So that will give you another good source on the battle, and it's not as well known as it should be, and I think it deserves to be read even today. More detail, just for the novel itself. I'll mention a few of these. A couple of books by a chap called Tim Saunders. There's The Battle for the Bocage, Normandy 1944, which covers the initial fighting after the landing on D-Day itself. He's done one on Hill 112, which obviously is where the name of the novel comes from, and the different fighting around that. Extremely good, lots of information telling you about what both sides are doing, lots of personal accounts, lots of good reading of the landscape. He and some of the other authors mentioned here have also done battlefield guides for these areas that are extremely good as well. You've also got in Dalgleish Over the Battlefield, Operation Epsom, which makes use of aerial photographs, among other things, to look at Operation Epsom, which is included within the story. My characters get involved in that. And, of course, J.J. Howe, Hill 112 is the classic and the earliest account of the fighting in Hill 112 that remains extremely good. There are other books on the subject as well, and if you look at my website, you can see it's not quite a full bibliography of all that I've read preparing for the novel, because there's so much I've read over the years that I don't necessarily remember, but it was going along my shelves and seeing, oh yeah, that's relevant, I've read that recently. Another good book, Kevin Baverstock, Breaking the Panzers, The Bloody Battle for Rauray, Normandy, 1st of July 1944. Again, an incident that features in the story, and it's breaking down a battalion's battle and trying to understand it in detail that is very, very useful for looking at how the British Army worked and how it functioned for the framework of the story. So these sorts of things I found particularly useful, and there are others such as a lot of good Canadian books on defending Juno, and Terry Kopp on the Canadian Army in Normandy. There's an excellent book. I'll flash up the cover because I haven't got it written down. I can't remember the title, but I'll put it up now. On the Black Watch of Canada in Normandy, Verrier Ridge, which is later in the period I'm dealing with, but it's extremely good at looking at how a Canadian battalion of the time was put together, how it trained, how it coped in the different stages of the battle for Normandy. So there's an awful lot out there. There's a tremendous amount of good stuff. As I say, I've got a more detailed list on my website, adriangoldsworthy.com, where if you click onto the page of Hill 112, you can go down, you can find much more of far more books to look at, and personal memoirs and all this sort of thing, and studies of particular units. There's a lot more out there. So there is a lot of material for this, and much of it is very, very good. The non-fiction coverage of Normandy is extremely good, which is partly why I thought a novel that summarises and draws on this sort of thing might be of interest to people who don't necessarily want to start with all the non-fiction. And I think we already mentioned, it came up in the comments on one of the earlier videos, Alexander Barron's novel From the City, From the Plough, about a battalion, probably of the Dorsets, in Normandy, written not long after the Second World War by someone who was in the army in the Mediterranean and then in Normandy. It's extremely good, and I'll just mention this one bit of fiction, but it's well worth a read if you don't already know it, because it comes across as so authentic. If there's a a slight criticism, he writes about a battalion composed mixed of men from London and the East End, and he writes about them very fluently and clearly knows them, and men from youngsters from farms, from villages, from the West Country. You don't feel he quite gets them, gets their voice or understands them, which is perfectly reasonable. There's nothing wrong with that. And he still writes with sympathy about them, but they sort of feature almost as background in the story, that he doesn't quite know their world. And it's an exceptionally good novel, so expecting something to be absolutely perfect and to cover lots of other stuff as well is unreasonable. It's remarkably to the point. I'm someone who, as you can tell from these videos, is inclined towards being long-winded, and I love the detail, and I love expanding on it. I like getting into the sort of nitty-gritty of things and how it all worked, and I do that whether it's non-fiction or fiction. It's what interests me. I'm trying to understand how these things actually work, how units operate, how individuals behave. He gives a flavour for all of that without going into detail all the time. And there are some things where you don't quite know what happens to the battalion commander, who's a very appealing character in the story. He is hit during their final attack, but you don't know, does he survive? Is he wounded? Is he dead? It gives you such a sense of being there, that it's so strong that it works. Again, these things that are, you'd like to know more. It's probably a sign that it's such a good story in the first place, and it captures your imagination, even though, as I say, it's often not so specific about a lot of the stuff that goes on. So obviously I'd like people to go and buy Hill 112, and I think you should. It's marvellous, and perfect gift for all your friends, this sort of thing. Again, you want a good novel on Normandy, then I don't think you can do better than From the City, From the Plough. So anyway, having possibly undermined my own advertising campaign at this point, hopefully this has been of interest, and there's a few more books that maybe not everybody knew about as suggestions. As I say, look at the website, adriangoldsworthy.com, if you want even more suggestions. So that's it for today. Thanks. Bye.